Having a parent pass away is one of the most difficult and heart-wrenching experiences that we will ever go through. And just the thought of having to sell their home can be overwhelming. And if you're going through this situation, you might be thinking, well, now what? Well, I recently helped a family that went through exactly this. The home was full of memories, and every time they walked through the house, they were flooded with emotions. So in this video, I wanted to share with you how I helped them and ultimately was able to give them the closure that they so desperately needed. Now, the very first thing that I want you to do is you need to secure the house. I want you to first change the locks because you ultimately don't know who has a key. It could be a contractor, that may be a bill that hasn't been paid yet, or a cleaning lady. You want to make sure the locks are changed because ultimately the house is going to be vacant. And you want to check the utilities. Make sure the utilities are paid up to date, how you pay those utilities, what the name of the utility companies are. Make sure those lights stay on and the heat stays on. And then lastly, notify the neighbors. The neighbors will likely know that your parents passed away, but it's a good idea just to check with them just in case because they'll be able to keep an eye on the house. Now, once the house is secure, the next thing you need to do is find out what the legal and financial situation is with your parents' estate. Did they have a living trust? Did they have a will? Did they have neither? That is super important. That is what's going to determine how you can even sell that property. Now, a living trust is probably the easiest way to transfer ownership. And a living trust is defined as a legal document or trust created during an individual's lifetime, the trustee or grantor, where a designated person or trustee is given the responsibility for managing that individual's asset for the benefit of the eventual beneficiary. So what that means is if your parents have a living trust, they will determine while they're living how all of their assets are handled after they pass away. Who gets the house, how the net proceeds are split, who gets the diamond ring, how all of those assets, the car, cash, everything. And then in addition to that, there is a trustee or a designated person that's in charge of making sure that all the beneficiaries receive how the assets are going to be split per the trust. So if you have 5 children and the oldest is the trustee, that's the designated person. It makes it very streamlined and easy to execute in order to proceed with putting the house on the market, getting it sold, getting the, dispersing of the assets, not trying to leave it up to the courts or probate. And probate is a word that you hear a lot after someone passes away. So what is probate? Well, probate is the legal process that occurs when a person dies that involves the validation and administration of their will. Probate can take a long time. Some states, depending on where you live, it could take a couple months. It could take over a year. And the probate process, when you are grieving, when you want to move on, but yet you're stuck because you have to wait for the court system to allow you to actually sell the property, can be super hard. And the thing is a lot of people think that having a will is the answer, and it's not. A will still has to be probated. So if your parents have a will, I would encourage them to set up a trust. A living trust is very easy to set up. But having a will in itself is not enough to bypass that waiting period process. Now, the next thing you want to do is check to see if there's any outstanding debts. Do they have any unpaid mortgages? Do they have any home equity lines of credit or home equity loans? Do they have a reverse mortgage? Reverse mortgages can be tricky, and it is super crucial that you know that up front to make sure that you go through all the paperwork and find out what exactly is the outstanding balance on that reverse mortgage. And then you want to check to see if there's any outstanding liens. Did they have any work done to the house that maybe a contractor didn't get paid for and they put a lien on the property? This can all be done at the Registry of Deeds. You can do it on yourself, or you can hire an attorney to check that, check into it to make sure that you understand every single debt that is attached to that property. Okay, so now you have all the legal and the financial information. You know exactly what the situation is with the house. Now it's time for probably the hardest part. It's sitting down with your family members. And the family that I mentioned earlier in the video that I recently helped go through this process, they had 5 children, and it was tough. the children, every one of the adult siblings were on a different page. There was some disagreements on how they should proceed, and it was very hard to get everybody on the same page. The first thing that I'm going to recommend is that you try to have an understanding and an appreciation and respect for everyone's emotional process. Everyone's going to process grief differently. Everyone has a different timetable for working through that. And if you have a trustee that wants to move the process forward, that has more of a business mindset, that is able to work through their emotions maybe a little faster, and they want to get going. You want to get going and get this thing on the market, because ultimately the quicker you move through it, the more you can put it past you. And that's the way you process it. Well, if you have a sibling that is not that way, that's where you're going to have problems. You're going to have difficulty. And if you have a living trust that stipulates how the house is handled, it's still going to cause issues. So trying to meet people where they're at, trying to be empathetic. And again, this is tough. You're going through one of the most difficult things that you can go through in your life. It's not easy. It's not a light switch. And I get that. But if you can practice empathy, you can try to give people the space they need, it can make a huge difference in the overall process. Now, what happens if you can't get on the same page and maybe you have family members that just won't come to the table, regardless of how much time you've given them? Well, it might be time for a family mediator. A family mediator, an outside party that will come to the table and try to bring people together, a professional. That may be a great choice to try to just move on and break through. A third party that's not attached in any way, shape, or form. As a real estate agent, oftentimes I play a mediator, but I'm not truly a mediator because I'm a hired party. And that is different than having someone that is totally separate, that their only job is to try to bring people together. So if you're in that type of situation, you may want to consider bringing in a mediator to help resolve some of that conflict. Now, hopefully you have some sort of meeting of the minds with your siblings, and you're able to now sit down and actually talk about what's the best way to sell the house. Now, there are no clear ways. There is not a right or wrong answer to this question, because everyone's house is different. Everyone's home, everyone's parent situation is different. Now, the first option is to sell it as is. If you have a parent that maybe there was some deferred maintenance, they were living in the home a long time, maybe they were not paying attention to some of the maintenance, maybe they couldn't afford to maintain the house, and there are a lot of things that need to be repaired on that house to get it to today's acceptable standards. Now, there are pros and there are cons to selling the home as is. The first pro, the good reason, the first advantage of selling a house as is you don't have to deal with anything. You don't have to put out money for repairs. You don't have to deal with the time frame. You don't have to deal with buyers that might nitpick during a home inspection. You're selling it as is, warts and all. And that can be freeing to a certain degree because oftentimes in a situation like that, your primary target buyer is an investor, and investors typically move faster. Now, what's the drawback? You're going to lose money. Plain and simple. And this is why there's no right or wrong answer. There's no easy right way to do this, because the priority on that situation is that you're hands off. You don't want to dealing with contractors that are going to do repairs. You're just going to take hands off, step back, and whatever you get is what you get. And if that's okay, then that's the right situation for you. But at the end of the day, you could have a house that needs $50,000 worth of work, but that investor's not going to pay $50,000 below market value. They're looking to make a profit, so they're going to offer $100,000 below market value. Now, the other option would be to make deferred maintenance repairs. Now, I am not talking about updating outdated kitchens or outdated bathrooms. I'm talking about replacing the leaky faucet or servicing the furnace that hasn't been serviced in a little while. Or maybe you have some window rot or maybe there's even a roof leak that your parents didn't even know about because they never go in that bedroom. Those deferred maintenance items now will allow you to appeal to a wider audience when you put it on the market. Instead of just appealing to investors, now you can appeal to the average buyer that's okay with an outdated house as long as the maintenance items have been fixed. And when you can appeal to a larger audience, now the price goes up. So that is another option to consider when you're putting the house on the market. Now, the next step is to figure out exactly how you're going to sell it, whether you're going to go for sale by owner, hire an agent, or just sell it private sale to an investor. Now, going FSBO, for sale by owner, is an option. And a distinct advantage to doing that is saving some money. You don't have to hire a real estate agent. You can save some money on the commissions and handle it yourself. And, honestly, if you're an experienced home seller and you've been down that road before, or maybe you were a real estate agent and you're no longer selling real estate, but you know the process, then that's great. However, when you are in this type of situation where you have strong emotional attachments to the house, I want you to proceed with caution, because negotiating on your own behalf, pricing it on your own behalf without an outside party like a real estate agent can be tricky. It's hard to separate those two because at the end of the day, the buyer that buys your home doesn't care that your parents passed away. They don't care about the emotional attachment or that your parents built the back deck or any of those things. They do not attach value to the house for those items, but you might, and you might price it to reflect that. So if you're going to do for sale by owner, you want to proceed with caution. The other option would be to hire a real estate agent and go the traditional route. Now, I talk a lot on this channel about how to properly hire a real estate agent, and it is no different. When you're going through a process like this, it can be a little bit challenging in a situation like this where you have multiple home sellers, aka siblings, family members, and this person may have their favorite agent and this person has their favorite agent, and everyone has, I've used this person. It can be tough, and I have seen this more times than I can count. Having that meeting of the minds at the very beginning of the process and trying to get on the same page and exactly how you're going to proceed is why you do that first as opposed to now. Because knowing exactly how you're going to proceed with this moment on hiring an agent and interviewing agents is going to save a lot of headache. I do recommend interviewing at least 3, and it might be more. If you have 4 siblings and everybody's got their favorite, maybe you all interview all 4 agents. You want to find an agent that has experience in this type of situation, general experience, but experience with going through this process, especially if it's a probate process. I can't tell you how many times I've been on the opposite end representing a buyer, and the listing agent has no idea what they're doing in a probate process and is not representing the seller properly, telling me that we're going to close in 30 days when in actuality, we're not closing for 6 months. So having someone that is experienced in probate in this type of a home sale is crucial. But you also want an agent that is going to be sensitive to the needs of everyone involved. You're not expecting them to be a mediator, but you kind of want them to act like a mediator, to empathize with everyone, to try to bring everyone together, because that is exactly what I had to do with that family that I mentioned earlier. And again, I'm not a mediator, but I'm experienced in handling these types of situations so that I can say those things that help this sibling understand where this sibling is coming from and try to bring them together. So you want to make sure that you interview multiple agents. Now, if your siblings don't have agents or you want to get someone on the outside, which I do recommend, just for comparison, I am happy to connect you with one of my preferred agents. It doesn't cost you anything. And if you don't use them, that's fine. But the agents that I vet out on my preferred network, having been in this industry for almost 30 years, my standard's pretty darn high. I talk a lot on this channel about the 80% agent versus the 20% agent, where in my opinion, especially over the last 10, 15 years, I think 80% of the real estate agents in the real estate industry are not worth what they're getting paid, and they're not fully skilled in this profession. As a matter of fact, 60% of the agents in the industry right now got into the business in the last 5 years. They don't have the same skill set. But the 20% the agents that are highly experienced, those are the ones that are sometimes hard to find. And the agents that are in my preferred network, typically have more than 15 years experience under their belt. And that's important. Somebody that's been there, done that. So if you would like me to connect with one of those agents, there's a link in the description. You can click that and I'll be in touch with you. So once you decide how you're going to sell the house, now it's time to get the house ready to sell. The very first thing you need to do is you need to empty the house. And this is a very tough emotional process to go through. And especially if you have some tension in the family, deciding which goes where is going to be tough, and what you want to keep, what you don't want to keep. But you've got to get started. And the first thing that I want you to do on that emptying process is set a timeline and a deadline. Now, this is just, regardless of what you've been given from the legal side, whether the probate court is telling you it's going to be 6 months or it's going to be 2 months, doesn't matter. You need to set a deadline, because that is what is going to push everybody forward, push you into action, help you make those decisions. And ultimately, you're going to decide whether you're going to trash it, keep it, or donate it. Those 3 things. Now, getting caught up on the keep pile is a thing that most people do in a situation like this. And, because things have emotional attachments, and you want to keep everything because it reminds you of their parents. My grandparents passed away several years ago. My parents went through this. My mother went through this with her mother's stuff, and as a result, ended up bringing a lot of it back to her own house because she couldn't make a decision at that time. She couldn't part with that emotional connection to many, many items. And that is okay. And I would say if there are a lot of items that either you can't make a decision on or you can't agree on, you may want to just put it into a storage unit. And I would, make sure that it's a climate controlled storage unit, but put it in a separate place where you can make that decision after maybe some of the emotional fog has cleared. Now, if you have a house, if you have a situation where your parents' house is chock full of stuff, and I had this situation not too long ago, last year, as a matter of fact, and my client's mother was a collector. She was an avid collector and had a lot of nice things, but he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know, he didn't want to throw it away. Didn't want to necessarily donate it. But he didn't know what to, it was overwhelming, and he lived out of state. So I recommended to him a professional senior move manager that also does estate sales. And they essentially came in and took over. They sorted through, they made sure that, okay, yes, you definitely are not interested in keeping these items, great. And then they sold the items. They kept them in tune with the process. They knew, so that he ultimately had control over what the items sold for. But he did not have to handle it. They cleaned out the house for him. They also took care of trash and all the things. And that was the solution. And those solutions exist. That might be a good solution for your family, especially if you're in that type of a situation. Now, after the house is emptied, you want to do a deep cleaning. Now, oftentimes I recommend just hire a professional cleaning company to do this, because it is already emotionally taxing to go through that clean out process. And now you're going to add another 4 or 5 hours to do a deep cleaning. Allow a professional cleaning company to wipe down the windowsills, do a deep cleaning of the stove, let them prepare it, because a lot of these cleaning companies specialize in pre-listing cleanings. And if you specify that's what it's for, they'll know how to clean deep enough to make sure that it shines from a presentation perspective. Because at the end of the day, what sells a house is presentation and pricing, which leads me to the next item, the last item that you want to decide on before you put on the market. And the cautionary tale that I would give you is make sure you price it right. This is the thing that really gets a lot of folks caught up, because they will attach emotional value to the actual market value. I mentioned this earlier in the video. Your dad built the deck. your dad, built the shed or whatever. And the hours and the weekends, and the weeks that he put into it has value to you, but has absolutely no value to a buyer. And having an outside source like your real estate agent or an appraiser to come in and say, what is the actual market value? That is crucial. I can't overstate how important that is and how often I see estate properties overpriced because the family can't agree on the pricing. The family is confusing emotional value with actual market value. Now, once you have it on the market, you get an offer, negotiate the offer, you have it under contract. Now you're getting ready for the closing. And when it comes to the closing, this is going to be the finality. This is going to be your closure of this whole process. There's a couple of things that I want to make sure you do. And the first thing is you want to double check with your agent or your attorney or your title company who's handling the closing. You want to confirm what the actual closing timeline is. And here's the reason. Every state is a little different on how the closing timeline works. Some states, in Massachusetts, the closing date is the date that the deed transfers, and the home seller needs to be out of that property on that day, 100%. In other states, the closing date and the deed transfer happens, but the seller actually has a couple days after closing to move all their stuff out. You want to be 100% clear on your responsibilities, because the last thing you want is a sudden surge. You say, oh gosh, the closing is tomorrow. I didn't realize we have to empty the rest of mom and dad's stuff out because maybe you left a few pieces of furniture for staging purposes in the house and you need to get that stuff out of there. Now you're rushing. You want to understand what that timeline is before you get there. The other thing I want you to do is I want you to take pictures. I want you to take video. I want you, since the house is empty, everything is exposed. You have the ability to walk through that house and immerse yourself one last time in the memories of that house. You can walk through the kitchen and take pictures of where your mom used to cook or your dad used to cook. You can go in the living room and take a picture as if you're sitting watching TV with your folks. You can go in the driveway and take pictures to remind yourself when you rode your bike and skinned your knee. Those pictures are different than your run-of-the-mill pictures that you may have taken growing up. And to be honest, likely you're not going to have the same pictures that you have today. The pictures 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, are not of the same quality. And they weren't taken in the sense that they're trying to preserve that type of a memory. So going through and having those so that at the end of the day, when you close that door for the final time, you're not walking away from your parents' house. You're not walking away from your parents' home. You're walking away from a house, 4 walls and a roof. That's all it is. You're taking those memories with you. And that closure part of this process, I can't overstate. I cannot overstate. You'll be looking back at that in 6 months and saying, gosh, a year, 2 years from now, saying, boy, I'm glad I did it. I'm absolutely glad I did. Now, going through this process is different for everyone. And some are more challenging, some are less challenging. But regardless of your situation, knowing what the next step is, knowing how to navigate this process so that you're not in a situation after your parents pass where you're sitting there saying, now what?